Halloween has come and gone, the Sweet Home review I was being all hush about is now out in the wild, and that means it's now time to move on to our next main video. And as this has worked out beautifully the last couple of times, we're once again going to do a little democracy to see what's getting the cult classifications treatment next. If this is your first time sitting in on one of these, the process is simple. I'm going to give you the rundown on 6 different candidates, 2 of my own choosing, 2 fan recommendations, and the lucky losers from Volume 2, and then you can hop down into the comments to say which one you want to see a video on next. The only real wrinkle to consider is that the vote is done in a ranked style, so you can write in the whole list if you like, in the order of your preference. You can also just choose your favorite and leave it at that, or pick anything in between, and I will make considerations for all of that when tallying things up, with the final scores affecting how likely it is that the losers will appear in future votes. It's all pretty simple, just a fun way to let you, my audience, have a say in what's coming next. And so, without any further ado, let's dive in and check out our candidates. There's been a rise as of late in AA games that feel like they're from the 7th generation, and pointedly wearing the same trappings and design sensibility as their Mountain Dew-drenched forebears. Often it's for the sake of budget, as things tended to be a bit more straightforward back when we were all figuring out the switch to HD, but many also seem to be doing it to thumb their noses at how needlessly overwrought modern gaming has become. And one of the best examples of this trend is Evil West. It was developed by the Polish studio Flying Wild Hog, who cut their teeth during the very early days of the not-quite-boomer shooter revival with games like Hard Reset and the 2013 Shadow Warrior reboot and its subsequent sequels. If you've played any of those games, then you already know that they have a predilection for going over the top when it comes to spectacle, while keeping the story side of things light and unobtrusive. Evil West is them leaning hard on those same strengths, but with a hokey tale of vampire slaying in the Old West, all while trying their hand at a mix of third-person action and shooting that feels much in line with a lot of the forgotten titles that followed in Gears of War's wake back in the day, and which have been this channel's bread and butter. It's a game I've only played a little bit of right back at launch, and just the first couple levels, and that's because I could almost immediately tell that it was a title that was going to need a video at some point. That little sip I had was just that perfect mix of gleeful abandon, tongue-in-cheek humor, and a dash of jank. That specific bouquet that says it belongs on this channel. And as such, I've been saving it diligently until the right time. But I think I'm about finally ready to mosey up to the bar and pop the cork on this modern vintage of an old-school recipe dark red. Video games have always quite famously borrowed a lot from film, especially action movies, and especially during the 2000s when graphics were finally getting good enough to really emulate cinematic bombast. And in that exchange of ideas, no one has been quite so copied as John Woo, and his signature style of dramatically over-the-top gunplay. With that in mind, it only made sense that we eventually got a game that instead of simply referencing his works, was instead a direct continuation, and that was Stranglehold, a video game sequel to John Woo's Hong Kong classic, Hard Boiled. Published by Midway back before they fell to bankruptcy and were devoured by Warner Brothers, Stranglehold was one of the more ambitious projects of their twilight years. Not simply another rote third-person shooter with a fancy license, Stranglehold was developed by Tiger Hill, a studio Woo co-founded with Midway, in which he served as a producer. And while his focus in this role was primarily centered around the game's story, he was also actively involved in guiding the development team, who previously made PsyOps the Mindgate conspiracy, about how to translate his unique style to the game as a whole. Further adding another layer of authenticity is the fact that this game also brings back Chow Yun-Fat to reprise his role as Inspector Tequila, using his likeness and voice work, along with some digital magic, to bridge the 25-year gap between the film and this full-fledged sequel. As for how this all turned out, well, gameplay-wise, it's a very solid and stylish, albeit not revolutionary, third-person shooter in the fashion of the era. But in a year as packed as 2007, and from a company that was in as dire straits as Midway, that just wasn't enough. As such, it's largely fallen into the crack between the couch cushions of history, but I've always wanted to go back to it and give it a proper shake. Not only is it an excuse for me to actually sit down and watch a bunch of John Woo movies, his works being an admitted blind spot in my cinematic experience, but it's also an excuse for me to dive into the history of Midway and talk about the very messy period in the late aughts, during which an icon of gaming history painfully fell into ruin. As someone who was born an old man with old tastes, I've always had an appreciation for the dregs hanging out at the very back of the Disney vault. While I may be of an age where I saw the 90s classics in theaters and had the same collection of battered VHSs as everyone else, my most worn tapes were the compilations of old cartoons from ages back. Hell, to this day, my favorite piece of Disney anything is the Skeleton Dance from 1929. There's just something about it that even almost 100 years later still feels special. A seemingly effortless humor with an ever so slightly unnerving edge to it. And in 2010, Epic Mickey sought to capture a very similar sort of feeling. Coming from Warren Spector of all people, the father of Deus Ex, Epic Mickey was intended as a grand, dark reflection of the House of Mouse's history with a particular focus on the theme parks. Early concept art showed twisted and broken animatronic versions of Disney stalwarts, and a lot was said of the game's morality system and how it affected the world at large, but also Mickey himself. The idea had amazing potential and seemed uncharacteristically self-aware for Disney, especially attached to their coveted corporate mascot. But despite that, they were seemingly all in, even going so far as to trade ABC's Al Michaels to Universal to get the rights back to Oswald the Rabbit, who would play a pivotal role in the game, with it being his reintroduction to the Disney universe. But despite all that potential, and despite that grand bit of corpo kung fu, Epic Mickey did not live up to expectations. It received middling reviews at launch, and while they did make a sequel, the writing was already on the wall for Disney's digital division, which would then dramatically scale back over the following years. If that's not a prime story for me to explore with one of my videos, then I don't know what is. And after being requested by a fan of the channel, it's been high on my list ever since. The only reason it hasn't come up sooner was that getting the tech together to cover it properly has been a bit of a struggle. It was a necessary one though, because while there is a modern remake of it courtesy of THQ, which we will look at, I knew from the start that the only real way to give Epic Mickey its proper due was with a Wii Remote in hand. As I've covered in depth before, a lot of publishers during the 7th gen were trying to come up with their own takes on Gears of War to entice Western audiences. But that's not the only franchise with that acronym that saw its fair share of imitators. There were just as many, if not more, God of War clones going around at the time as well, with a lot of different companies digging through their back catalog to try to find anything they could to retrofit into angry QTE-filled bloodfests. And one of the most appropriate IPs dredged up for this purpose was Namco's Splatterhouse. To give a bit of context, the series started out in the late 80s as a horror movie themed arcade provocation to all the hubbub around video game violence. But after a couple of sequels and slash-to-hell ports, it was eventually buried. Its purpose fulfilled, and the games themselves not really having a ton to them outside of the gore, as they were pretty basic side-scrolling beat-em-ups. However, like any good slasher villain, it didn't stay dead. It simply lay dormant until a return was announced in 2008, now re-envisioned as a Kratosian-style brawler. And, like its fellow Namco Bandai alum Inversion, things then went unnervingly quiet with multiple delays. Mind you, they did do some promotion here and there, but maybe not as much as you might expect going into their somewhat inconspicuous launch in late 2010, And of course, given its spooky subject matter, it naturally launched at the scariest time possible during that fall season. Late November. Between the bad timing and trend chasing, it was unsurprisingly more or less forgotten. But here's the thing, I actually really enjoyed Splatterhouse. As mentioned, the franchise was a perfect fit tonally for that particular style of character action. And conversely, thanks to it being themed off cheesy slasher flicks, it also managed to be a lot more tongue-in-cheek than those sorts of games normally were. Add in some metal bona fides thanks to a well-put-together licensed soundtrack, and then being able to revel in everything an M rating can provide in ways they just couldn't back on the TurboGrafx, and you've got a modern revival that truly feels authentic in ways so many others at the time did not. And as far as I'm concerned, that earnestness more than merits Splatterhouse going under the knife and becoming the subject of one of my ever so thorough autopsies. Mentioned ever so briefly in my Homefront the Revolution video as I was going over Free Radical / Dambusters history, Second Sight is an unassuming little title put out by that same developer and released smack in the middle of their spree of far more successful Time Splitters games. Going for a darker tone than their prior titles, Second Sight's story is focused on parapsychology and divergent timelines, for lack of a better term, and to try not to spoil anything, with even the box art comparatively putting off a very different vibe to that of Time Splitters. To complement that, it also strayed away from the more run-and-gun antics of the dev's flagship franchise in favor of a greater focus on stealth, puzzles, and of course psychic powers. Spooky elements aside, it actually sounds closer to a lot of the later work the dev would do on Haze, Crisis, and of course Homefront the Revolution than the more arcadey Time Splitter stuff people were used to seeing from them at the time. As for why it never managed to gain wider acclaim, it's hard to say. Its lead platform was the GameCube, as I recall, which wasn't exactly the destination for shooter fans at the time, so that probably didn't help. Though it did also release on the PS2, Xbox, and eventually PC. It was also published by Codemasters, which, if you've seen my Damnation video, you know had a shaky catalog as a publisher, especially back in the aughts. Funnily enough, looking over the Steam DB listings for Second Sight, it seems it was actually a pre-order bonus for the PC version of Damnation, so that's a fun connection. Personally, while I am familiar with it and remember seeing it on shelves back in the day, I never actually played it, at least that I can remember, and I'd be very curious to dive in and see what it's like. And thanks to one of you asking for it, now I just might. Oh, I was wondering when I would eventually have to play a David Cage game for this channel. I have been dreading the day when I would have to descend into the very French depths of pretentious insanity that his works encompass. That said, if I'm going to cover any one of his titles, it might as well be Indigo Prophecy, better known as Fahrenheit outside of North America, as it's right at the point in his career, and in gaming technology as a whole, where his whole deal actually makes sense. It's past the early and horrifically clunky days of Omicron the Nomad Soul, but before the PS3 burned down the forest in the middle of the Uncanny Valley and blew all the resulting smoke up his ass with heavy rain in his further works past that. It still carries all of his hallmarks, of course: bizarre, awkward controls and gameplay ideas, clumsily juggled yet lofty story concepts, uncomfortable sex scenes. It's got the whole package. But it is more reined in, as it was published by Atari. He didn't have that Sony money quite yet, and it's somewhat less pretentious than his later games. The 6th gen was also just a really good time for weirder titles like this to break through the noise and make a mark, and it's why it did well enough to gain critical acclaim and really give him and his studio Quantic Dream the long-lasting legacy they've had since. It's a legacy I'll certainly cover to some degree as well, but I think this video will be more about seeing if Indigo Prophecy still holds up in the modern day as an actual video game. While I've seen plenty of it over the years, it's prime fodder for any number of Let's Play channels for a reason, I've never actually sat down and played it for myself, so this will be the chance to see if it's really as bad and as good as people say. And those are our candidates. Nothing left to do now but for you all to hop into the comments and hey, wait!
Bonus round!
That's right, we're doing an extra vote this time around. With the massive growth of the channel since the release of the Bureau, and YouTube slowly waking up and remembering that I exist, it only felt right to set an actual sub-goal for once. And what to do for such an occasion is something I've been mulling over for quite some time now. My initial instinct was to cover something legendarily bad and poke at it with a stick, like many other video essayists do, but that's not really emblematic of my style in the way I was looking for. I then considered doing a meme game, where it's not necessarily truly terrible, but everyone else and their dog has already talked about it, and I wouldn't really have too much new to say. Again, not off the table for a regular video, but not fit for some grand celebration either. And then it came to me. What this channel does, what I see people coming back here for video after video, it's not to see me suffer through dreck or point and laugh at failures, but to see me earnestly dig into titles that are misunderstood and yet still quietly loved. That's the take I see most often from my comments, and the videos that have performed the best on the channel so far absolutely fit into that mold. As such, it seemed only right to make my first big sub-goal a vote between 3 of the most requested games I get back from you, my audience. And so, in addition to your picks for the next main video, I want you to include in your comment your choice between Binary Domain, Fracture, and Dark Sector as your pick for what will be the Cult Classifications 25k sub-spectacular. And yes, I can already see the snark. Why 25k when 10k is right the fuck there? And the answer is, because I'll be making that celebration video in the margins while I work on other stuff, and I need time to do it up right. After all of those games I just mentioned have been emphatically suggested over the years at least a dozen times each. I don't want that big video to be slapdash. No matter which games win though, for both votes, I can't get to work until you all decide what you want to see. So get your comment in below listing your picks. Polls will be open until the end of November, and on December 1st, I'll declare the winners of both races and get to work. In the meantime, though, I'll be taking a well-deserved break, after what has been months of constant video work. And if you'd like to show your appreciation for those efforts, make sure you're subscribed to the channel, have that fakakta bell on, and like this video. While YouTube may have finally taken note that we do some good stuff around here, that algorithm is vicious, so every little tiny scrap of engagement is precious, especially for a channel like mine that doesn't put out content all that often. One last bit of housekeeping to bring up is that I did recently rejigger the Ko-Fi tiers and have scrapped the monthly podcast. As for why, well, frankly, there just wasn't enough interest to keep it going. I only had a couple of supporters on there, and while they're both amazing dudes and I was more than happy to make content just for them, it's incredibly hard to justify spending close to a week every month on videos that only 2 people are gonna see. That's doubly so when looking at my analytics, I can't even justify working on a lot of the smaller projects I've done, as they just don't get the views, Sweet Home being a perfect example, unfortunately. As such, I'm recalibrating how I approach things, now focusing wholly on my main videos and trying to make those to as high a standard as I possibly can, shelving those smaller efforts until the channel is in a place where it can support them. Honestly, in making this shift, I was just going to shut down the Ko-Fi entirely, as I figured without the podcast, the value wasn't there. But instead, both my current supporters told me to keep it live and keep it monthly, as they wanted to keep chipping in to help make Cult Classifications something special. And I genuinely can't thank them enough for that, and for all their support so far. It really has meant the world to me. And if you want to join in with that, well, I'd be honored to have you added to the credits alongside them. But that's enough sappiness for now. You've all got voting to do, so get to it. And no matter what wins, I hope you enjoy that next video. Take care of yourselves, and as always, have a good one.